Let's begin with the 11th lecture on Exodus. In chapter 21, God gives the Israelites several rules. First, God gave a rule concerning slaves. Please read verses 1 through 3. These are the laws you are to set before them. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years. But in the 7th year he shall go free without paying anything. If he comes alone, he is to go free alone. But if he has a wife when he comes, she is to go with him. God told Moses to set laws before the people. Laws refer to God's commands, his judgments. How was an Israelite to buy and treat another Israelite slave? A person became a slave of his neighbor because he faced financial difficulties. God commanded that when a fellow Israelite became a slave of another person, the slave was to work for 6 years and be freed on the 7th year. God considered 6 years of slavery to be enough, and he granted freedom in the 7th year. Luke chapter 4, verses 18 through 19. The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind. There are poor people in this world. There are people who are poor financially and people who are spiritually poor. The world is full of people who are not spiritually satisfied. If a man became a slave by himself, he was to leave by himself on the 7th year. If he was married, he was to leave with his wife. God considered the marital relationship important as well as the family. Verses 4 through 6. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and only the man shall go free. But if the servant declares, I love my master and my wife and children, and do not want to go free, then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door or the doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. Then he will be his servant for life. Let us say that a slave was single when he began to work as a slave, but he got married later on and had children. In such a case, the wife and children belonged to the master. In such a case, only the slave had freedom, and not his wife and children. Will I give up my wife and children for freedom? Will I give up freedom for my wife and children? If the slave said, I will continue to serve you, master, because he loved his wife and children, the master would take the slave and pierce his ear with an awl. This was not a merciless act, but it was a mark put on the slave. The mark indicated to whom the slave belonged to, as well as which master he served. Verses 7 through 8. If a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to go free as men servants do. If she does not please the master who has selected her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to foreigners because he has broken faith with her. If a man sold his daughter as a slave, she was not to go free as a male slave. However, if the master did not like the slave, she was to be freed. Selected her for himself refers to marriage. The slave girl was to be freed if the master had no plans to marry her. Verses 9 through 11. If he selects her for his son, he must grant her the rights of a daughter. If he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, and marital rights. If he does not provide her with these three things, she is to go free without any payment of money. If she was selected for the master's son, he was to treat her like his daughter. However, let's say that this master had the heart to marry her at first, but later changed his mind. If he married another woman, he was to give certain things to the slave. First, he was to give her clothing. Second, he was to give her food. Third, he was not to deprive her of marital rights. Although she was not his wife, he was not to abandon her. If he did not do these three things, she was to be freed. This shows that there are things we must do for those who work for us. We must respect their characters and rights. God does not ignore our basic human rights. God does not degrade women. From verse 12, God speaks about the death penalty. Verse 12. Anyone who strikes a man and kills him shall surely be put to death. Anyone who struck a man and killed him was to be put to death. If anyone murdered another person, he was to be put to death. There are many people today who argue that the death penalty is a system that ignores human rights. The death penalty refers to execution of those who committed crimes. Human rights of the living are important, but the rights of those whose blood have been unjustly spilled are also important. Verses 13 through 14. However, if he does not do it intentionally, but God lets it happen, he is to flee to the place I will designate. But if a man schemes and kills another man deliberately, take him away from my altar and put him to death. Let's say that a man killed a person by accident. For example, a man's axe blade flew off while he cut wood, and it killed another man. Today, people accidentally kill people in car accidents. This is known as accidental homicide. In such cases, he was to flee to a place God chose for him. This was the system of cities of refuge. The Jordan River was the center point, and God chose 3 cities to the east of the river and 3 cities to the west of the river. The cities of refuge refer spiritually to Jesus Christ. It is also the church in today's time. It shows that even a murderer can be saved if he flees to Jesus Christ. In verse 14, it says that whoever murdered another man on purpose was to be put to death, even if he was in the altar. Planned murder is a serious sin. It shows that God would not forgive him. Verse 15. Anyone who attacks his father or his mother must be put to death. Whoever attacked his father or his mother was to be put to death. There are people who actually hit their parents, and there are people who cause their parents pain. God is strict with those who wrong their parents. A believer must honor his fleshly parents. Verse 16. Anyone who kidnaps another and either sells him or still has him when he is caught must be put to death. This refers to taking someone by force against his will. This refers to kidnapping and human trafficking. People who were guilty of kidnapping or human trafficking were to be put to death. Verse 17. Anyone who curses his father or mother must be put to death. This is the same rule that is in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 9. If anyone curses his father or mother, he must be put to death. We believers must not curse our fathers or mothers. Fathers and mothers do not only refer to our physical parents, but also our teachers and seniors. It refers to pastors in the church. There may be things that pastors lack or do wrong. Still, we must not curse them. God is not pleased with that. God said that the murderer should be put to death. This shows the justification of the death penalty. Whoever took a man's life was to give his life. Especially when one struck or cursed one's parents, he was to be put to death. We must treat our parents right and respect them. Verses 18 through 19. If men quarrel and one hits the other with a stone or with his fist, and he does not die but is confined to bed, the one who struck the blow will not be held responsible if the other gets up and walks around outside with his staff. However, he must pay the injured man for the loss of his time and see that he is completely healed. 2 men fought. One man fell because the other struck him with a stone or with his fist. If the man did not die and could walk outdoors with his staff, the one who struck him was not held responsible. However, he was to pay for the other man's loss. He was to pay for all the fees until he was completely healed. Believers must not fight with one another. The church must not give positions to people who strike others. The church is not a place for fighters. Verses 20 through 21. If a man beats his male or female slave with a rod, and the slave dies as a direct result, he must be punished, but he is not to be punished if the slave gets up after a day or 2, since the slave is his property. Let us say that there was a male or a female slave, and they did not obey their master. The master struck them, but struck them too hard. If the slave died as a direct result, the master was punished. But the master was not punished if the slave got up after 1 or 2 days. The master did not have to pay for damages even if the slave died, because the slave was his property. Verse 22. If men who are fighting hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there is no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. There were men who were fighting who hit a pregnant woman and she gave birth prematurely. If there was no serious injury, the offender was to be fined whatever the woman's husband demanded. They were fined with what the court allowed. God considered the lives of babies and premature babies valuable. Verses 23 through 25. But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. This meant that they were to pay for what they did. They were to pay back life for life and eye for eye. If someone broke another man's hand, he was to pay back hand for hand, foot for foot. God considered this righteousness. This was just judgment. However, getting revenge was not. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. Do not seek revenge, but love your neighbor as yourself. If we were struck by a man, it would not be right for us to kill him. If we were struck on the cheek, we could hit the other person on his cheek. This was God's justice system. However, what did Jesus say? Jesus told us to love even our enemies. We must pray for our enemies and feed our enemies if they grow hungry. This does not mean that a believer or a church should become fools. Believers should not sue one another. Yet it is okay to sue and go to court with unbelievers or with the world. Judges, prosecutors, and the court system were all created by God. When one encounters an unjust experience, they should ask and talk to judges. Verses 26 through 28. If a man hits a manservant or maidservant in the eye and destroys it, he must let the servant go free to compensate for the eye. And if he knocks out the tooth of a manservant or maidservant, he must let the servant go free to compensate for the tooth. If a bull gores a man or a woman to death, the bull must be stoned to death, and its meat must not be eaten. But the owner of the bull will not be held responsible. A master struck the eye of his male or female servant, and then the slave lost one eye. Then the slave was to be set free for the lost eye. A master broke a tooth of a slave. If a master broke the tooth of his slave, he was to be freed. Let's say that a bull gored a man or a woman to death. The bull was to be stoned to death. Yet the bull was not to be eaten. If it died, the owner was not held responsible for the death. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 22. We must avoid every kind of evil. Now let's say there was another bull. Verses 29 through 31. If, however, the bull has had the habit of goring, and the owner has been warned, but has not kept it penned up, and it kills a man or woman, the bull must be stoned, and the owner also must be put to death. However, if payment is demanded of him, he may redeem his life by paying whatever is demanded. This law also applies if the bull gores a son or daughter. There was a bull, and it had the habit of goring. If the bull killed a man or woman, the bull and its owner were to be put to death. However, if the owner offered to pay a ransom, he was to pay as much as the judge decided. The same law applied even when a bull gored a man's son or daughter. Then verse 32 says that if a bull gored a slave, the owner was to pay for the slave. The owner was to give the master 30 shekels of silver. The bull was to be put to death. Verses 33 through 34. If a man uncovers a pit or digs one and fails to cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit must pay for the loss, he must pay its owner, and the dead animal will be his. An ox or a donkey fell into the pit a man dug but never covered. The man was to pay the owner for the dead animal, and he was allowed to take the animal and eat it. He was to pay the owner for the loss. Verses 35 through 36. If a man's bull injured the bull of another and it dies, they are to sell the live one and divide both the money and the dead animal equally. However, if it was known that the bull had the habit of goring, yet the owner did not keep it penned up, the owner must pay animal for animal, and the dead animal will be his. There were 2 bulls, and one bull killed the other bull. Then the owner of the living bull was to sell the animal and share the price, and the dead animal was to be shared between the owners. However, if a bull had the habit of goring in the past, and if it killed another bull, then the living bull was to be given to the owner whose bull died. The dead bull was given to the owner whose bull killed another bull. The owner was to be liable for not training his bull from goring. Chapter 22 is about restitution. Please read verses 1 through 3. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he must pay back 5 head of cattle for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. If a thief is caught breaking in and is struck so that he dies, the defender is not guilty of bloodshed. But if it happens after sunrise, he is guilty of bloodshed. A thief must certainly make restitution, but if he has nothing, he must be sold to pay for his theft. If a man stole an ox or a sheep and sold it, he was to repay 5 head of cattle for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. If a thief was caught breaking in, and a person struck the thief to death in the evening, he was not guilty. But if he died after sunrise, the person was found guilty. If a thief was caught, he was to make restitution. But if he had nothing, he was to sell his body as restitution. If one stole sheep and ox, and if the animals were alive, he was to pay back double. Verse 4. If the stolen animal is found alive in his possession, whether ox or donkey or sheep, he must pay back double. A man left his animal in a field or vineyard, and the animal crossed into another field and destroyed it. Then he was to pay the loss with the best in his own field or vineyard. If a man set fire to stacked grain or the standing grain, and the fire consumed the field, he was to make full restitution. Verses 5 through 6. If a man grazes his livestock in a field or vineyard, and lets them stray, and they graze in another man's field, he must make restitution from the best of his own field or vineyard. If a fire breaks out and spreads into thorn bushes, so that it burns shocks of grain, or standing grain, or the whole field, the one who started the fire must make restitution. Let us say that a man left his things with his neighbor for safekeeping, but the neighbor lost it. What were they to do? If the thief was caught, he was to pay double. However, if no one knew who stole the things, they were to come before God. The one who caused harm was to pay double. However, what if the owner did not lose his things, but a thief came? Because he did not do it, he was not liable for the loss. Verses 7 through 11. If a man gives his neighbor silver or goods for safekeeping, and they are stolen from the neighbor's house, the thief, if he is caught, must pay back double. But if the thief is not found, the owner of the house must appear before the judges to determine whether he has laid his hands on the other man's property. In all cases of illegal possession of an ox, a donkey, a sheep, a garment, or any other lost property about which somebody says, "This is mine," both parties are to bring their cases before the judges. The one whom the judges declare guilty must pay back double to his neighbor. If a man gives a donkey, an ox, a sheep, or any other animal to his neighbor for safekeeping, and it dies or is injured, or is taken away while no one is looking, the issue between them will be settled by the taking of an oath before the Lord that the neighbor did not lay hands on the other person's property. The owner is to accept this, and no restitution is required. Let's say that the owner visited someone's house and the things he lost were there. That person was the thief. The thief was to pay back double. Another owner was looking after someone else's ox or sheep, but the animal was stolen. Or it died suddenly, or was beaten by another animal to death. Because the loss was not intentional but accidental, the person was not held liable. However, if the animals were stolen because of his carelessness, he was responsible for the loss. If the loss was a result of the owner's carelessness, he was responsible for the loss. If the animal was torn by beasts, he did not have to make restitution. Verses 12 through 15. But if the animal was stolen from the neighbor, he must make restitution to the owner. If it was torn to pieces by a wild animal, he shall bring in the remains as evidence, and he will not be required to pay for the torn animal. If a man borrows an animal from his neighbor, and it is injured or dies while the owner is not present, he must make restitution. But if the owner is with the animal, the borrower will not have to pay. If the animal was hired, the money paid for the hire covers the loss. Let us say a man borrowed an ox from his neighbor. He borrowed the ox, but it died during field work. What was he to do? Because he paid the hiring fee, he did not make restitution. Next, God talked about adultery. Verses 16 through 17. If a man seduces a virgin who is not pledged to be married and sleeps with her, he must pay the bride price, and she shall be his wife. If her father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he must still pay the bride price for virgins. If a man seduced a virgin and slept with her, he was to pay the bride price and wed her. However, if her father refused, he was to pay money equal to the bride price. Verses 18 through 20. Do not allow a sorceress to live. Anyone who has sexual relations with an animal must be put to death. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord must be destroyed. God told the Israelites that sorceresses and anyone who had sexual relations with an animal were to be put to death, and anyone who sacrificed to any god other than the Lord was to be put to death. Verses 21 through 24. Do not mistreat an alien or oppress him, for you were aliens in Egypt. Do not take advantage of a widow or an orphan. If you do and they cry out to me, I will certainly hear their cry. My anger will be aroused, and I will kill you with the sword. Your wives will become widows, and your children fatherless. God specially talks about aliens, orphans, and widows. Psalm chapter 68, verse 5. God is father to the fatherless and defender of widows. Verses 25 through 27. If you lend money to one of my people among you who is needy, do not be like a moneylender. Charge him no interest. If you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, return it to him by sunset, because his cloak is the only covering he has for his body. What else will he sleep in? When he cries out to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. If a brother borrowed money from us, we must not charge him interest. If possible, members of the church must not lend or borrow from one another, but if they do, it is right that they do not accept interest. If one decides that he must receive interest, he must receive the lowest amount of interest as determined by the bank. If a man took something from his neighbor as a pledge, he was to return it to him. Verses 28 through 31. Do not blaspheme God or curse the ruler of your people. Do not hold back offerings from your granaries or your vats. You must give me the firstborn of your sons. Do the same with your cattle and your sheep. Let them stay with their mothers for 7 days, but give them to me on the 8th day. You are to be my holy people. So do not eat the meat of an animal torn by wild beasts. Throw it to the dogs. We must not curse the rulers God has appointed, but we must respect them. It also says that one must not delay to give offerings to God. If they gave cattle or sheep to God, they were to offer it after 7 days had passed. If a son was born, he was to be circumcised on the 8th day after his birth. God said that no one was to eat any flesh that was torn by wild beasts. It meant that the people were to live as holy people. Thank you very much.